All right, welcome everyone to Come to Believe Network's latest panel discussion, the state of affordability in higher ed, state aid's role in student success. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Sam Adams, and I'm the Education Programs Manager here at CTB. It's a real pleasure to be with you for today's discussion. Just a quick overview of our time together today. I will do a brief introduction of our panelists. We'll have a research presentation about the impact of grant aid on college persistence and completion, followed by a roundtable discussion on the importance of state grant aid more specifically. And finally, we hope to have time at the end for audience Q&A. If you have any questions that come up at any point during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature as part of the Zoom webinar. So for those of you joining us for the first time, I'll provide a quick intro to CTB. So the Come to Believe Network was formed to provide higher education institutions with an innovative, results-oriented two-year college model that is accessible to students who are underrepresented at selective universities. The CTB model provides both a credential, it's an associate's degree, and a pathway to a bachelor's degree, what we refer to as a better normal for higher ed access. So the model was designed for students from low wealth backgrounds, and a core component of our work is making sure that it maintains its affordability, allowing students to complete their first 2 years of college with little to no debt. And so thus the model leverages federal aid, primarily Pell Grants and SEOG, as well as state aid, supplemented with private fundraising to provide students with a rigorous curriculum and high-touch wraparound supports without a high price tag. At Arrupe College on the campus of Loyola University Chicago, and Doherty Family College on the campus of the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, state aid programs play a crucial role in the model's affordability and success. So our panel today dives into programs like these, aiming to explain how they operate and their ultimate impact on students. But first, let me introduce our panelists. So we're going to begin the panel with a research presentation by Dr. Brent Evans, an associate professor of public policy and higher education at Peabody College at Vanderbilt University. Professor Evans conducts quantitative research on higher ed policy, using economics as a framework to focus on issues of college access and student success. His research interests include persistence in online post-secondary courses, loan aversion and its effects on college outcomes, the efficacy of financial aid on student and institutional outcomes, and high school interventions related to college enrollment and degree completion. His work is published in numerous outlets and journals, and he's received funding from the Institute of Education Sciences and the Lumina Foundation. Professor Evans completed his PhD at Stanford and also holds degrees from Harvard and the University of Virginia. We're also joined by 4 other expert panelists. Megan Flores is a senior manager of state financial aid programs. She joined the Minnesota Office of Higher Education in September 2016. Megan began working in financial aid as a student worker and has over 20 years of experience in financial aid at the campus level. Megan currently oversees programs such as the Minnesota State Grant, the Minnesota DREAM Act, tuition reciprocity, financial aid estimators, post-secondary child care grant, state work study, public safety officer survivor grant, fostering independence grant, and the summer academic enrichment program. Megan also serves as the state liaison between Minnesota and federal state aid. We're also joined by Sarah Pingle, who's a senior researcher at Ithaca S&R, where she focuses on public policy issues facing post-secondary education with a focus on finance and affordability. A recipient of federal and state financial aid herself, Sarah believes that policy can play a key role in promoting accessible, affordable pathways to post-secondary education. Previously, Sarah served as a principal at the Education Commission of the States, a 50-state compact focused on supporting state leaders with research and opportunities for collaboration. At ECS, Sarah led multi-year projects related to state financial aid and workforce and post-secondary connections. She has testified in multiple state legislative chambers and has been cited in local and national media. Sarah holds a bachelor's degree from UC Boulder, a master's degree from Bryn Mawr College, and a doctorate from the University of Denver. Jacqueline Moreno is the Chief Service Officer at the Illinois Student Assistance Commission, ISAC, the state college access and financial aid agency in Illinois. She began her career in college access just under 30 years ago at Loyola University Chicago, where she also earned her undergraduate degree. She's been with ISAC for more than 20 years. In her role at ISAC, she oversees all direct service to students and parents, including the ISAC Corps, Illinois Gear Up, and the First Generation Scholars Network, as well as supportive services to partners and practitioners in the field, including training and professional development, College Changes Everything, and the Illinois College Access Network. And finally, Frank Ballman has worked with the New York State Higher Education Services Corporation since 2008. He became the federal relations lead for the National Association of State Student Aid and Grant Programs, NASGAP, in March 2010. He has over 35 years of experience in education finance and financial aid programs, not counting completing the FAFSA and receiving grants, scholarships, loans, and work study to attend college. Prior to his work in New York, he worked for a variety of organizations ranging from startup companies to major financial institutions. He's provided education finance, college savings, and financial aid program advisory services to a wide range of organizations, including state agencies in Alaska, California, New York, Rhode Island, Texas, and Virginia, as well as the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Federal Student Aid. I'm looking forward to a great discussion. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Evans for our research presentation.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen here. Okay, wonderful. So thank you for having me, Sam. I really appreciate it, and lovely to be joined by all these great panelists. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I'm going to give you a sort of brief 15-minute or so overview of some of the research that I've done around the effects of grant aid on student outcomes in higher education. This is work that I did with two of my PhD students that were here with me at Vanderbilt, Tuan Nguyen and Jenna Kramer, who are now off doing their own great things at Kansas State University and at Rand. And we have conducted a systematic review and meta-analysis. I will preface this by saying this is not exclusively about state grant aid, although it definitely incorporates state grant aid, and we'll talk about components of that. But we're trying to get a lay of the land of the full effects of grant aid on students' outcomes in higher ed. So we're particularly focused on student persistence and degree attainment. So to give you a little bit of a background, there's a large literature that agrees that grant aid improves college enrollment. $1,000 of increased grant aid increases the probability of enrolling in college by somewhere between 3 and 4 percentage points. That's not to a specific institution, that's to going to college at the margin of attendance overall, with lots of research that backs this to varying degrees. There's a growing literature, but not nearly as large, of the effects of grant aid on persistence and degree attainment. So we're talking about post-enrollment outcomes. How likely are students to remain in college, and how likely are they to graduate with a degree? A subset of those provide causal estimates, and a causal estimate are those that we can reliably say the grant aid is what caused these improvements and outcomes. There's a lot of analyses out there that are not causal in nature that show an association, but there might be some other third explanation for why both grant aid and college outcomes improved. What we're really interested in is isolating the effect of grant aid outside of anything else. So we can really say it's the grant aid that affected these outcomes. And while many of these studies find positive effects, there are some studies that find null and a few that even find negative effects. And so we thought that the opportunity was there for us to conduct a systematic review and meta-analysis to help us sort through all of this extant literature and assess the overall impact of aid on persistence and degree attainment. So I keep saying this word systematic review and meta-analysis. What is this all about? The goal is to collect all of the studies that have been done and accomplished on this question of the effects of grant aid on higher education outcomes, and to sort through them, provide a sense of the overall state of that literature, and then to pool all of the quantitative results together. So we can take results across multiple different papers and studies and treatment effects and pool them all in a quantitative measure to come up with one overall effect of grant aid on these outcomes. And these results can provide more compelling evidence than an individual study, because individual studies are sort of rife with sampling bias or have generalizability limitations. They might just be about one specific program or state or institution. And so by looking across the whole of this literature, we can start to combine all of those and get a better sense of what's the overall average effect. It also helps us to sort through studies that might have individual issues, and it gives us an opportunity to think about why the studies that have varying results actually do have varying results. So that leads to 3 research questions. What's the causal effect of grant aid on student persistence and degree attainment, and across the studies that provide these causal estimates? The second is, how do those vary across study and program characteristics? And I'm not going to talk much about the study characteristics today, but we'll talk about some of the program characteristics, like what type of aid seems to be really useful. And then third, in order to align ourselves with the sort of broad conclusions about the effects of aid on enrollment, what's the effect of $1,000 of aid on persistence and degree attainment? So to do a systematic review and meta-analysis, you kind of go through these steps. You first establish study eligibility criteria, then you conduct a really broad literature search, then you code the identified studies to get their effect estimates out and identify the things that are important about those studies, and then you finally conduct the meta-analysis. So I'm going to walk through these steps just briefly so that you have a sense of how we are arriving at some of the results that we arrived at. The first is this idea of eligibility. So we need to establish what's going to be included in our review. We're looking at students in post-secondary education. So we're not talking about aid that's given to high school students. We're looking at aid that's given to post-secondary students. The students have to be eligible for some sort of aid program. The study reports quantitative results of post-secondary persistence or degree attainment. It provides causal estimates by employing experimental or quasi-experimental estimation strategies, some sort of statistical techniques that account for other variables that could be biasing the effects. And then finally, it provides what we call linear probability models, which just allow us to basically combine the estimates together into one broader estimate. So given that's what we were looking for, we went and conducted a literature search. And you do this by going through a bunch of databases and looking for all of the studies that include terms like financial aid, graduation, persistence, degree attainment, and all combinations of those things. And we found over 21,000 studies out there in the literature that include some combination of those terms. Now that's obviously, all of those are not included in the study. What we do is we read through the titles, abstract, introductions of all of those 21,000 studies to really narrow it down to the eligibility criteria. Which of these are about causal estimates of the effects of grant aid on persistence and degree attainment? And that got us down to 77 studies. And those are the ones that we really screened very deeply for their eligibility. Several of them were kicked out because they either weren't causal estimates or they didn't provide a number for some sort of persistence or degree completion outcome, or some other miscellaneous reasons. At the end of the day, we were left with 47 studies that met our eligibility criteria. 5 of those studies are international studies, which we include in our broad systematic review and meta-analysis. But today, I'm only going to focus on the 42 domestic studies that took place in the US. And within those 42 studies, we have to read very closely and code them for a couple different measures. The first is the outcome. And you might think the outcomes are very clear, but there's actually some subtlety to this. So there are 2 types of persistence outcomes. We can think about within year persistence. That is, you persist from one semester to another semester or one term to another term within the same academic year. And there's many studies that offer estimates on that number. And then there are other persistence measures that are year-to-year persistence, which I think is what people would typically think of when we talk about college persistence. And there are more studies that offer that year-to-year persistence measure. But we have separate estimates for both of those. And then degree attainment, we can think about both on-time degree attainment and delayed degree attainment. And so we're going to provide 2 different estimates, one for each of those outcomes. A further element of complexity to this is, since we're studying higher education outcomes, we can either study them conditional on enrolling in college or unconditional on enrolling in college. So I'm going to show you most of the results today that combine both of those 2 studies, but we also separate them out. More of the studies are about conditional on college enrollment. In general, they provide similar estimates. But that complexity is an issue that we needed to code for. And then there are all these other variables about both the study quality, like what was the estimation strategy? Was it an experiment, a quasi-experiment? Was it peer-reviewed, published in a high-quality journal, things of that nature? And then more important for our purposes today, what are the characteristics of the grant aid program that were understudied? What's the type of aid program, the source of the aid, and any other program characteristics, like additional supports that are beyond financial aid? So to give you a sense of all of the different studies that were included and some of their descriptive characteristics, you can see the publication year between 2004 and 2017. We rated most of them as high quality studies. They're all causal studies. About half of them were in peer-reviewed journal articles. They are large samples. So we're talking about sample sizes an average of 17,000 students that range from the smallest of 115 to over 100,000. The average amount of aid that the students were receiving was about $2,500, although that also ranged substantially between very small, a couple $100s, up to extremely large, almost $20,000 in some of the private aid sources here. 26% of these studies studied a program that also had some additional treatment that was not just financial aid. And these additional treatments were typically either academic or informational supports, some sort of additional tutoring or guidance counseling, or some information to help guide them through the college process. 21% were strictly merit aid awards, and the others were primarily need-based awards or incorporated some component of need. And that's going to be important later when we try to discern, is need-based aid or merit-based aid seem to matter more for improving these outcomes. And then across those 4 different outcomes that I talked about, 9 provide within-year persistence estimates, 25 year-to-year persistence estimates, 20 on-time completion, and 19 delayed completion. And since we're talking about state grant aid, I thought I would give you a sense of some subset of these studies are about state grant aid. All of the following states are included in some way, shape, or form. These are the studies, there are studies of each of those state aid programs in various capacities that we found and incorporated into our meta-analysis. So not comprehensive coverage, but pretty good coverage across the United States. Okay, so when we actually conduct the meta-analysis, there's sort of 2 goals. The first is to examine the effect estimates and how they vary across studies. And I'm going to show you a figure that will give us a sense of that. And then the second is to combine all the effects from all these different studies into a single number for each outcome. Like, what is the actual effect of grant aid on this outcome? And to do that, we have random weights, if you want to get into the technical things about it, this sort of formula. But essentially, we're going to weight these studies in this analysis by how precise they are. Okay, so then we can get to some of these results. The first is this plot of all the different studies that give an estimate on year-to-year persistence. So each row of this is a different study that provides an estimate on the effects of grant aid on year-to-year persistence. The central vertical line in the middle is a 0 effect estimate. A couple studies to the left of it provide negative effect estimates. Studies in the middle, where those bars around each dot overlap that 0, are basically not statistically significant. They provide a 0 effect estimate. And then studies to the right provide positive effect estimates. And so on average, studies are positive. The effect sizes of those climb up to 0.12, 0.19. But on average, the effect size estimates is around 0.02. I can talk about exactly what that means in just a minute. There are a couple studies that have negative results, several studies that have null results, and then a larger number of studies that have positive results, some of which are statistically significant and some are not. So when we get down to actually figuring out what those results are, I want you to focus on this column of this table. So these are the effect estimates of the effect of grant aid on the outcome that is to the left. So within year persistence, year-to-year persistence, on-time completion, and delayed completion. And these results are reported as probabilities of those things happening. So the 0.032 means that grant aid increased the probability of within year persistence by 0.032, which is a 3.2 percentage point increase. So on the whole, we're seeing effects of grant aid increase persistence and degree completion by somewhere around 2 percentage points, with a little bit higher for the within year persistence effects. So these are statistically significant results. This is sort of what you do when you combine all of these estimates together and determine that actually there is an effect of grant aid, fairly small. 2 percentage points isn't enormous, but it's consequential, especially when we consider that it's easier to get students into college from the 3 to 4 percentage point effects that we saw from enrollment. Doesn't seem to be as effective at the enrollment margin, but still does improve outcomes. We also can look at variation in those outcomes by a number of different program characteristics. And so that's what we're going to do here. This is for the persistence outcomes. The first top panel is within year persistence. The bottom panel is year-to-year persistence. And that first row of 0.032 and 0.018 are the results I showed you from the prior table. A couple things that I want to highlight here. The first is that when you add an additional treatment into the program, whether it's an academic or informational treatment, the effect size grows. So near doubles in the case of within year persistence, not quite that extent in the year-to-year persistence. So it looks like programs that are providing additional supports beyond grant aid have a larger effect. When we look between the difference of merit aid and need-based aid, we see much larger effects for need-based aid than we do merit aid. And that is true both within year persistence and year-to-year persistence. It's going to be true on the subsequent page around degree attainment as well. On the whole, it looks like merit-based aid doesn't provide as much of an enhancement to degree completion and persistence as need-based aid does. And then finally, when we look at the source of aid, the institutional private aid sources seem to be the most efficacious, although I will point out those also tend to be the most generous. That at the top end of $17,000, $19,000 of aid, those amounts of aid are coming from institutional and private sources, and those tend to be more effective than the state and federal aid policies, with federal being sort of the lowest. And if we look at the results for degree attainment, we see really similar patterns. Added treatment effects have larger results than without. The merit aid has less of a results than need-based aid. The private sources have better results than the state sources, which have better results than the federal sources. And then to get to that final question of how much does $1,000 of grant aid matter? Now we want to really account for the amounts and not, count the same impacts of something that gives $20,000 of aid as something that gives $2,000 of aid. And here we see across, whether we adjust for inflation or not, positive effects between sort of 1 and 2 percentage points per $1,000 of grant aid. And that's true across these outcomes. So I think the broad conclusion here is $1,000 of grant aid seems to be increasing persistence and degree completion by somewhere in the 1 to 2 percentage point range. These are sort of marginally statistically significant. You do get a statistically significant effect if you look. This is just conditional on enrollment if you look for everybody, but it's at the kind of margin of significance, in large part due to the limited number of studies here. We're talking about sample sizes of 6. Maximum of 20 studies. So in summary, combining results across the literature demonstrates there are positive returns to providing grant aid on degree completion, and $1,000 is increasing degree completion and persistence by about 1 to 2 percentage points. Need-based aid tends to have a larger effect than merit-based aid, and supplementing aid with additional treatments such as academic or informational supports seems to be very effective. We'll talk more about policy implications, I think, in our conversation, but at a high level, I think I want to highlight two. One, from an institutional perspective, when we're talking about institutional aid, there are some institutions that practice something called front loading, which is they give a lot of aid in the first year in order to induce somebody to come into college and then withdraw that aid and give them less aid in subsequent years as students persist. And although that practice might be effective at inducing students to enroll, it may come at the cost of persistence subsequently. And at the state level, pertinent to our conversation here, it seems that merit aid is well documented as keeping students in the state and stemming brain drain and might increase enrollment, but it doesn't appear to increase persistence and degree attainment. And so we should just be honest that that likely comes at a cost, and that we should also consider designing policies that address barriers beyond just the financial ones, because those that address academic and social barriers beyond the financial barriers seem to be having a larger impact. Okay, I'll leave it there and turn it over to Sam and the rest of the panel.
Excellent, thank you, Brent. So I guess I'll start by opening up to the rest of the panel. Curious how these findings that Brent walked us through, how do they align with your experience? There's decades of experience on the panel here in terms of working with students with higher ed finance. So how do these findings align with you, this positive impact that Brent's finding in terms of the impact of grant aid? Yeah, Jacqueline.
Well, I was pleased to see that Illinois was included in there. And, we have found that when we control for school choice, our grant recipients graduate at about the same rate as everyone else, which when we're talking about the highest need students in the state is a significant thing to be able to say. I think that's consistent. I also appreciate very much the element of this presentation comparing these two opposing things, merit aid to stop brain drain versus retention and persistence. I think they're frequently talked about as the same thing, and they are not. So I enjoyed that element of this very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm hoping to get into some of the nuance in terms of what kind of goes into different state aid programs. Frank, were you going to offer a comment?
Yes, just a little bit of background for anyone who's not familiar with NASCAP. We're the 40-something state grant agencies that provide about $14 billion annually in grant and scholarship aid. Roughly 75+% of that is need-based. Some of it is a combination of need and merit, and some of it is purely, we call it non-need based. But I think generally speaking, states are interested in they have degree attainment rules like called the drive to, or goals, the drive to 55. Like we want to have 55% of our adults have degrees or worthwhile certificates by 2025, things like that. And to move the needle on that, need-based aid definitely, I think we've always thought is more helpful, more beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
I will say the flip side is in some states, you have to figure out what can you get through your legislature. Mm-hmm. And that's a not insignificant consideration. And sort of a lesson from Tennessee Promise is that it's not really need-based, but the flip side is, for us policy wonks, hey, fill out the FAFSA, get money for college. We understand what that means. But when you have a billboard in Tennessee that says free college, apply here, that has been very effective at getting a lot more low-income students to fill out the FAFSA. So there's a lot of variables that go into it, but overall, I think, with the disclaimer, 50 states, 50 different views and approaches. I think generally speaking, I think states get the idea that need-based aid is the most effective way to move the needle on their degree attainment goals.
Yeah, Sarah.
I think I would just build on what Frank said, to just say that, like, yes, there's this overwhelming evidence that when college is affordable, people stay and they finish at higher rates. Right. And there's a lot of different ways to get at affordability. And so I think that what Dr. Evans's research shows us is that financial aid is one potential way to get there. From my perspective, like, I still hear questions from policymakers around, like, can we contextualize these effect sizes against other approaches to college affordability too? So is aid the best way or the most efficient way to get there? I think is still an open question that a meta-analysis of the existing literature probably wouldn't address, and wasn't the intent either, right? So just saying that, right? So could lowering tuition for everybody be really important, or is there some other approach out there, some rock we haven't unturned yet when it comes to making college more affordable that could be more impactful here? I think the other thing that's really interesting to think about too is, and it's probably not possible to disaggregate the meta-analysis this way, but which of these studies focus on the impact of one program versus the collective impact of multiple, as Come to Believe does, right? You stack all of that, your Pell, your SVOG, your institutional grant, is there a question around the efficacy of patching together aid packages versus something like Frank alluded to in Tennessee, where yes, it's still patched together, but it's not marketed that way, right? Versus one program to rule them all, right? And yes, 16 states are represented, 49 states have aid programs. And so I think that also points to just yes, there's a lot of evidence and a lot of research here, and there's still a lot of uncovered ground. And so that's really exciting too, when you think about all the other research questions that could still be possible when it comes to state aid and affordability.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's also just the element of a meta-analysis, which is, it's great because it's extremely reliable. You're bringing all these different things together and you're kind of reducing the variation. But, but then you also it would be nicer to start with just the 20 percentage point increase in this one study, and, but the meta-analysis really adds this credibility by bringing all these things together and still finding those positive increases. Any other just immediate reactions to Brent's research? I think we'll have time to offer. Megan?
Oh, I was just going to mention, I thought it was also interesting looking at the merit versus the need-based. In the state I represent in Minnesota, we do not have merit-based aid, but definitely taking into account when you look at that institutional aid and seeing that strong correlation between institutional support, which does tend to be merit-based. Mm-hmm. And I think that's intentional for, getting that student in on the front end and being able to quickly assess prior to FAFSA, prior to any kind of need assessment, what kind of aid could this student have, and that meets a certain segment of student population, probably more traditional age dependent students, but that definitely that there might be different approaches that make more sense depending on the population you're trying to serve. And so just being able to look at it through a different lens, I think, is important.
Great. Before we dive into the next part of the conversation, Brent, is there any other, you mentioned the implications kind of that you drew out of the research. Is there anything else you'd offer to policymakers or institutional leaders about your research or things that you'd want them to know?
Sure. I think, thank you for all these points. I agree with everything that was said. There is, I think, to Sarah's point about all the unstudied things out there, we're relying on scholars to kind of go do that, right? And one of the problems with the meta-analysis is I'm just looking at what's already been done. And there's ample opportunity to do more. I think a couple reasons why there haven't been as many studies across some states is the data just isn't readily available to do that. And so part of this story is if you want to know what's going on in your state, you need to really develop good data systems and share those with researchers so that we can figure out what's going on in your state. And there's a reason why some states are studied more than others, because they have really robust data systems that enable scholars to look at that. So that would be my other pitch as a scholar.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think if you look at the Illinois Student Assistance Commission website and the Minnesota Office of Higher Education website, you see, a large degree of information on there about data, about who the students that are being served and things like that. So I want to credit both of those institutions with kind of that paying attention to those data points. I think it makes research like Brent's possible. So let's dive into the panel discussion. Frank, you gave us a little bit of background on NASCAP before, but I'm hoping you can paint a picture for us here about the broader state aid landscape. So Brent mentioned 16 studies are in his study, but there's a lot more state aid out there. So can you tell us a little bit about what state aid is and what are some of its defining features as you see it?
Okay, so, at the federal level, sometimes like support for Pell Grants is very bipartisan, but then there's a lot of things about when you're appropriating money for student financial aid that can be a little more partisan. At the state level, it's typically, I'd say, nonpartisan. And if you kind of look back, all the big innovations, except for the Georgia Hope Scholarship, were enacted by Republican governors and with Republican legislatures, because we've all heard of Tennessee Promise. The actual first free college program at a statewide level, other than Georgia Hope, was a $1 program in Indiana called 21st Century Scholars that was the brainchild of Governor Mitch Daniels. And then people think about need-based aid to Dreamers as being a very democratic thing. But I famously remember seeing a governor talking about why need-based aid to Dreamers is important in his state and talking about how it attracts employers and it helps grow the economy. And so I was in the Speaker of the House's office giving this sort of recap of what I heard the governor say this morning. So the response goes, so what Northeastern liberal governor said then? I said, oh, that's Governor Rick Perry in Texas. And Texas was by far the first state to provide need-based aid to Dreamers. So it's not just about helping people, it's also about helping build your economy. And when you focus on outcomes, it sort of makes it a lot easier to pass a bill. And the chambers of commerce in quite a few states are big advocates for student financial aid because they need more people to help fill. Like right now, there's something called the Job Openings Labor Turnover Survey. There's over 11 million vacant jobs in America. A lot of those require 21st century skills. We need more people to get degrees. And one of the new focuses in states is like in Tennessee, they call it Tennessee Reconnect. It's helping adult students or adult former students go back to college to finish a degree. Or my favorite story is I had computer science skills from when I went to college. The only place I can use those skills now is at the Smithsonian, and the computer's behind the glass. So, if I want to be in programming again, I need new courses, new skills, new programming languages. So it's the easiest way to sell student financial aid to say a more red or Republican state is talk about this will help build jobs, it builds the economy. And that's a lot of the framing we do. One last note about NASGAP, and I'll let other people talk, is NASGAP only endorses things at the federal level if we get a unanimous vote of our executive committee supported, like we support double Pell, for example. But if we have a unanimous vote of NASGAP's executive committee, which is 10 people, that really suggests we're proposing something that's bipartisan or nonpartisan and is common sense. So generally speaking, a lot of things we've supported have gotten passed. Double Pell is more an aspiration than something I expect to pass this year. But no, I think that's a quick overview of how states look at why they invest in student financial aid. And even though they have to balance their budget, it is an investment, not spending. Like Illinois did a study many years ago that showed every dollar invested in their monetary assistance program grant resulted in $6 in additional tax revenue. So that's a pretty good investment.
Absolutely. And so when I think about the state landscape, when we, as from Come to Believe's perspective, thinking about the state aid that would provide support for students like it does in Illinois and Minnesota, one of the things that really stood out to me is the decentralized nature of it. These, every state has its own approach. And so Sarah, I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit more about this, because when you were at ECS, the Education Commission of the States, you did a lot of work at kind of building a database of these different programs, and they're very diverse. So can you tell me a little bit about what characteristics help us differentiate these different programs? How are they similar and how are they different?
Yeah, great question, Sam. So it's easy to kind of fall into the belief that they all work like Pell, right? If someone has an EFC in a certain range and they enroll in an eligible institution, at least in 3 credits, depending on their cost of attendance, they're going to get a grant. And what really, what you said is true is that there's in reality a lot more variation across the states in terms of how their aid programs are deployed. I think of those kind of in 2 separate buckets. So the first being kind of how they're governed and how they're set up. And the second kind of area where a lot of aid programs differentiate is in how they distribute the aid to students. So in terms of how they're set up, I think one thing that people don't realize right away, unless they come from a state that does this, is a lot of states actually block grant student aid to institutions that then have significant latitude to get to pick the student recipients on the back end. Because those programs are usually underfunded, institutions then receive eligibility criteria that would include more students than they receive funding for. And so there's a lot of institutional discretion in the packaging process when it comes to state aid that we don't really have clear ways to account for, that impacts what students are ultimately selected sometimes for state financial aid. I think it's not just a state law or a state regulation that dictates who gets the aid. In some cases, in some states, there's a state agency. So Illinois is a really good example of that. Minnesota is a really good example of that. And sometimes those are housed with the state higher ed executive officer, as in Minnesota, and sometimes they're a little bit separate, right? So in Illinois, there's a board of higher ed, but then there's also the Student Assistance Commission. There's 2 different agencies, right? And then sometimes it's really just up to the institutions to make these decisions, right? There's a direct appropriation made, and then institutions kind of have a lot more latitude in terms of selecting recipients. In terms of how the aid is distributed, there's eligibility criteria, but then there's also, I think, equally and perhaps even more importantly, timing. So most state aid programs do not operate as entitlements the way the Pell Grant does, right? Where if you qualify, no matter what day of the year you fill out your FAFSA, you'll receive a Pell Grant, right? Most state aid programs are underfunded relative to the number of students that would be eligible. And that means that there are other rationing mechanisms in place at the state level to determine who's going to get those funds, right? Usually that's a pretty blunt tool. The deadline is usually what's used. Sometimes they're as early as February, March. Sometimes they can go later into the year. Some states have rolling or multiple deadlines in order to preserve access for students at different points in the year who may decide outside of the regular semester-based timeframes that they want to attend post-secondary ed. And so whether your program is set up to be need-based or merit-based, or most commonly a combination of both, the deadline can often be the determining factor of whether or not you're going to get the aid, right? So I guess to answer your question, Sam, there's a lot of variation out there, but it's not completely opaque. So one of the things that I did when I was at ECS with a team of a lot of really capable researchers was we created categories to categorize states by, are they centralized? Are they need or merit based? Are they block granting? Or are they, giving direct lead institutions? Are they based on a deadline? And so there are frameworks out there to understand the variety of ways that states provide aid. It's not like a total black box, but it is much more complicated. Even not to say the Pell Grant isn't complicated, but it is much more complicated than fill out a FAFSA, get an EFC, find yourself on a table and get a Pell Grant. There's a lot more to it, but it's not completely opaque.
Great, thank you. It's super helpful. So I want to now dive into the state level and kind of talk specific. So Jacqueline, I'll start with you here. So ISAC is the service provider for the largest state aid program in Illinois. That's the MAP grant, which Frank mentioned earlier, the Monetary Assistance Program. So can you tell us a little bit about how the MAP grant works, just as an example? So how do students have access to it, and what role does ISAC play in the distribution process?
Yes, absolutely. And using Sarah's language, we would be centralized, but how we talk about it is that it's student-centered. It follows the student. So it's completely need-based, which is hugely important for us. It's more than $500 million, completely need-based, and it follows the students. It's restricted to tuition and fees. And ISAC was, my goodness, more than 20 years ago now, we were the first agency to eliminate an application for state aid. We just used the free application for federal student aid. When the FAFSA was invented, ISAC switched to the FAFSA. I wasn't at ISAC yet, but they switched to the FAFSA so that students did not have to understand how to navigate multiple systems. They just needed to complete the FAFSA. And they didn't even need to know, and some of them still don't know, that the monetary award program grant even exists, because they automatically apply for it. It is first come, first serve, and there's not a deadline per se. We project each year based on previous years and complex modeling and rates as we go through how much money will be available. So we award until funds run out. In FY21, I believe FY21 was the first year in 20 years that we were able to make an award to every student who applied, which was an incredible achievement and an uphill battle. Now we need to work on affordability. We have more than $500 million, but it's still not kept pace with tuition. But at least now we can talk about that instead of that we are not awarding everyone who's eligible and who applies.
Excellent. So just for the point of comparison, and I can attest, as so thinking about Arupe College, how helpful the MAP grant has been. Shifting to Minnesota, where Doherty Family College is, Megan, can you tell me a little bit about your version of this? Is called the Minnesota State Grant, as like the biggest program. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Is the program pretty similar, or how does it differ?
Similar in some ways. Our primary need-based program is the Minnesota State Grant, and it is, designed to assist Minnesota residents, undergraduates. We do allow our primary need-based program to go to residents attending both public and private institutions, which not all state funding does. We are also decentralized for students who apply for our state funds via the FAFSA. So there isn't a separate state aid application. The exception would be we are one of 6 or 7 states in the country that do award all of our state-based aid to undocumented or documented students. And so we do have a separate state financial aid application for that population. And we do run that program as a centralized program. So I'm personally involved in the awarding for that program, as well as some staff that I support. Our program is designed to provide choice and access. So again, as long as they're a Minnesota resident attending a Minnesota school and they're undergrad and meet the eligibility, the grant follows them to whatever institution in the state they would like to attend. We do have our awarding formula in conjunction with the Pell Grant, and we use a designed responsibility model. And so that framework is really designed around that price, distributing the price of the institution between the students and families, taxpayers, both at the federal and the state level, and then taking into account the student's income, as well as the choice of institution they attend, that cost, and the enrollment level. And so with that, we've been quite successful as far as who benefits from the grant. Our last fiscal year, we had 122,000, almost around ballpark, students who completed either the FAFSA or the state aid via the DREAM Act and met eligibility according to our statutory language. And we did fund 59% of those, or about 71,000 of the students, because those were the ones that ultimately matriculated. Those grant totals include both state grant award under the FAFSA as well as the DREAM Act. And our percentage of applicants receiving has been pretty stable. We do have most of our grant recipients are dependent students, about 75%, and the rest are independent. And we typically fund around 200 million in that program per year. Very focused on low income and moderate income families or middle income families. And then the highest amount of aid going to those needy students. About 60% of our grant recipients have a family adjusted gross income of less than 40,000. And 42% of our state grant recipients are students of color, American Indian students. We do see the majority of them attending within the public sector, so our Minnesota State colleges and universities system. But we do, again, award both to our other institutions in the state. And I think, we've generally ranked as far as state funding per FTE around, 18th, 19th place within the country. And again, that combo of Pell Grant, state grant, typically, at a community college for high need student can cover all of their tuition and fees and books. We're seeing, for this coming fiscal year, grants of anywhere from $100 to up to almost $14,000 when you look at that combo of Pell and state. So that's a little bit about our program and kind of who it's serving and who it's meeting the needs of.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's great to see the comparison between the two. I think those two are, when you think about states, they're actually some of the more generous ones. You mentioned being in the top 20. And then I know that Illinois has also made a lot of recent strides in terms of the generosity of their awards. Sarah, I want to zoom out a little bit and think about, so you've at ECS, you were working directly with stakeholders, policymakers at the state level. And it's, as Frank mentioned, there are political considerations in play, so you can't wave a magic wand and just create the best program imaginable. You have to kind of work with what's available to you at the state. But I'm curious, what defines the programs that you found to be most successful, or kind of best practices that have emerged in your work with policymakers that you think might be useful to others working in the field?
Sure. So I think everyone at some point on this panel has alluded to the diversity of approaches that states take to awarding financial aid. And I think that diversity of approach is the strength of state aid and not a weakness. Yes, like for folks like Dr. Evans, it makes the research part really difficult because there's like these 50 different experiments or 49 different experiments going on when it comes to state aid, but I think that's really a strength. And so one of the things that I've tried to do in my work is really give policy leaders a conceptual framework to better understand how financial aid programs could function so that they can make better decisions that work for their context when it comes to designing and making changes and reforms around state aid programs. So I know at least Frank on this call has heard this spiel before, but we have 4 principles that we use to help institutions and policy leaders understand state financial aid reform. There are 4 kind of pillars of how we encourage folks to think about aid. The first is student-centered. So do you know what students you're trying to serve? Which behaviors are you trying to impact? Centering that first to say, okay, well, that needs to drive the design of our program, right? If we're trying to reach students who couldn't otherwise afford to go to college, what are some features of the program that we need to keep in mind to ensure that our program can actually deliver on that goal? The second is timely and flexible. So we believe that state aid programs that can be flexible and get away from using deadlines to ration aid and provide aid at a time that could actually impact a student's enrollment decision is also really key. So for students in some states, and I'm talking about a very traditional kind of the minority of college students at this point in time. They could have to make a decision around which college they're going to attend in May, and they may not know if they're getting state aid or not until closer to the start of the fall semester. And so kind of aligning that timeline for a more traditionally aged student population, and then for the majority of today's college students, making sure that they aren't held to that timeline, and that if they're laid off in June, it wouldn't already be too late for them to think about starting college in August to retrain, right? The third is goal-driven and data-informed. So in this pillar, we really try to encourage policy leaders to think through what data are you collecting, and is it the right data to measure whether or not you're making progress towards your goal? So kind of, to Brent's earlier point about, some states just don't have the information systems to answer these questions, or they don't make those data systems available to answer these questions. To the extent that data can inform states' progress, we think that it's really key to make sure that that's integrated from the start. And the fourth is broadly inclusive. So we mean this in terms of the types of learning that students could receive financial aid for. In most cases, students can really only draw down state financial aid for credit-based coursework. And we know that students complete learning in a variety of different modalities today, whether that's through other types of learning assessments or exams, multiple institutions at the same time or in tight succession, employer provided training, different things like that. So kind of broadening the set of experiences that that states could consider as eligible for financial aid. I think the timing, especially around short-term Pell, the timing for these types of conversations around inclusion of different types of learning into eligibility for state aid is really ripe. So we'll see where that one goes as well. And of course, considering that inclusion on the backdrop of the fact that state aid programs are largely already oversubscribed. So what does that mean for access for students in traditional programs, making sure that funding moves in the same direction to allow for greater levels of inclusion. Those four principles aren't prescriptive, right? They're not directive, but they really provide, if you've thought about these four things in an intentional way, I believe that can move policy leaders towards more nuanced and more thoughtful policy when it comes to financial aid programs.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about the specific levers that policymakers can pull, Jacqueline, I noticed that in Illinois, that the size of the MAP grant just got bigger. It's increased actually pretty dramatically in the last 5 years. Most recently, I think for fiscal year 23, up to $7,200 per student. So I'm just curious, how did this increase come about? That's a big change for students in Illinois. And what impact do you think this increased generosity may have?
Well, our current governor campaigned on increasing the size of the MAP grant program. So it's been a front and center focus of the entire administration. But also, we really enjoy bipartisan, or as Frank said, nonpartisan support of the MAP grant program. And certainly, there's discussion back and forth every year about whether it should have a merit component or whether there should be sectioned off pieces for returning adults or dislocated workers or things like that. But in general, our data, which, we've mentioned some of it here, shows that we have great outcomes the way that it is, whether you're talking about, $6 per dollar, or whether you're talking about the fact that students who get this program graduate at the same rate as other students. It's a good thing. So contributing more to it the way it is eventually wins out, or so far has eventually won out in the policy discussions. Part of the reason that we were able to even get here is because we could stop talking about not having enough money to award everyone who applies. So, we awarded just under 140,000 students last year and close to that for the previous 2 years. And it increases every year. Even during the pandemic, the number of students we awarded increased. So we finally gotten to that level, and we were able then to focus on, we need to get back up to some comparison to the buying power that the grant used to have. So even with a maximum of 7,200 or 7,220, I can't remember which one it is, but it still doesn't have the buying power. I received a MAP grant 30 some years ago, and it paid for an awful lot of my tuition. And it has not increased obviously, which is different, a whole other, 5-hour panel discussion, I'm sure. But it should make, a tremendous difference for students. And, something else that Frank said earlier in talking about packaging the way you talk about things, free tuition is a reality for a lot of students when you stack Pell and SEOG and the state grant. We don't talk about it that way in Illinois, but we get a lot closer to it with this increase for more students. We already achieve it for many students.
Absolutely. So thinking about the intended impact here of increasing, you mentioned the parity between recipients and the broader population of students. Megan, I noticed that Minnesota has this goal of 70% post-secondary credential attainment by 2025. So I'm just curious what role you think that state aid plays in kind of movement toward that goal.
Yeah, I think most states we've seen more recently have some sort of initiative by the legislature to have some credential attainment goals. I think, for our state, we're looking at Minnesota adults ages 25 to 44 specifically having the attainment of a certificate or a degree by 2025. And so fortunately, we've been very successful in that. As we've already heard, adequate financial support can play a pivotal role in influencing enrollment and persistence. And we have been really, we tend to be purple. I think we are still the only divided legislature in the country. And so we have to find ways to work within bipartisan support. This specific goal, we've been able to have some innovative and new programs as well as targeted programs, that Sarah mentioned, like specifically who are we trying to get where. And since we've set that goal in 2015, we were at about 57.5% across all race groups. We've increased almost 4%. So as of the end of last year, we're now at 61.4, which is promising. However, when you break it down by specific race groups, it's not as promising. And so there's definitely some very specific kinds of targeted outreach as well as targeted aid that needs to happen for different communities. I think our state grant program, as I shared, has very broad support for really giving really good support to students based on socioeconomics. But when we start to look at some of those other factors, I do think it's important to kind of play a little bit more into what Frank mentioned, which is each state's working within the context of what is possible. And so I like to think about it kind of as working through a lens of finding windows of opportunities, or in a lot of cases, waiting for the right window, and then kind of weighing the pulse of who's in the legislature, what's kind of the hot topic going on, and then tailor approaches or policy initiatives within windows where we have the most opportunity for success. And sometimes that does mean just funneling as much money as possible into the primary need-based program. Other times it means working with specific specialty populations. We were able to this last session get through a new program for foster youth at any point in time in the system after age 13, a full cost of attendance. So in getting at basic needs through federal, state, and institutionally covering everything for every Minnesota youth who's been in foster care. And so that was a really big win for us to look at a very specific population that we see, unfortunately, disproportionate numbers of BIPOC students there, but also students who do not have high college going rates at all, much less completion rates. So I think, again, just looking at those completion rates, doing a tailored approach to who are you trying to serve and what ways can you. We've found really good support most recently in leveraging some of the additional federal dollars into workforce-based programs and training providers, as Sarah mentioned. And so we've had some Future Together grants and some very specific employment-based in partnership to get, like CNAs, for example. We had a very specific goal to train 1,000 certified nursing assistants in 1 month. And we were able to do that and get, we had a critical workforce shortage in senior facilities that was really got a lot of attention from many state agencies and the press, and concerned folks about their family members. And so having a very targeted approach of this specific high need credential for specific occupation and just putting a ton of resources into it and making it free for anyone who wanted to. We actually got 400 high school seniors to become certified nursing assistants. So it's been really creative approaches like that, I think, is helpful in influencing that attainment goal.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So this has been a very robust discussion. We're running up on the hour mark here. So Frank, I'll give you the last word. Just zooming out again to the national landscape. I'm just curious what you see as kind of the next frontier for state aid. Where are we? What are your organization's priorities? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think an increasing focus on I'll use Virginia Fox's term, contemporary students, like helping students who stopped out and need to come back and finish their degree. I think the Department of Education has a couple of innovative programs with its Operation Fresh Start, which removes the default from students, because the majority of defaults are not big balance loans. They're people who took a couple semesters and stopped out, and once they default, they're ineligible for Pell and typically ineligible for state aid. I think, as Megan alluded to, focusing on specific areas where there's a high need. Like I graduated with a degree in accounting, so I knew I'd get a job. We don't need more accountants, but we do need more nurses, more teachers, and most states want more STEM grads. So I think targeted approaches there are part of where we're headed. And President Biden proposed a college completion fund at $62 billion. What actually passed was $5 million. But between like Georgia State's Panther Retention Grant and City University of New York's ASAP program, those have been demonstrated to more or less double college completion rates and degree attainment. So I think that's the future. And one final little thing, one of the big supports that's more important, there's a lot of students who are also parents. So childcare on campus is a huge potential support.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's a great place to close, although I will say I've got more questions, so maybe we'll have to do a follow-up. Thank you on behalf of the audience. Thank you so much to each of the panelists for being here. It was a great discussion. Thank you for the research that really grounded the panel discussion well, and thank you for being such an attentive group of panelists. So with that, this panel will be made available on YouTube. I'll share the link with everybody that registered and all the panelists. But with that, have a great rest of your Thursday, and thank you again for your time.